Tonight, we're going far back, not to palaces or marble temples, but into the teeming, often terrifying heart of a medieval city, a place more complex and infinitely more perilous than any storybook could ever portray. You've seen the images, haven't you? The grand cathedrals reaching for the heavens, the bustling market squares, the armored knights on horseback, chivalry defined by stained glass and heroic tales. Most of us, let's be honest, carry this romanticized vision, a cinematic backdrop of festivals, guilds, and the quaint charm of cobblestone streets. It's a myth, really, cultivated by centuries of curated history and popular fiction, designed to soothe our modern sensibilities. You don't just step into the past and find only grandeur. You step into a world that, beneath its surface of pious devotion and feudal order, was a crucible of hidden dangers. You're not just about to discover uncomfortable truths. You're going to fundamentally alter your understanding of what it meant to survive, let alone thrive, in these early urban centers. No matter how many vibrant tapestries you've seen, or how many epic poems you've read, they almost completely omit the grinding, visceral reality of daily life in a place that, by modern standards, was a death trap. We're not talking about dragons or sorcerers here. We're talking about the silent, insidious threats that lurked in every alley, every drafty hovel, and often right beneath your very feet. Tonight, we're peeling back those layers of romantic illusion to reveal the truly uncomfortable, inconvenient, and often shocking perils that made medieval urban life an extraordinary act of endurance. You will never look at a picture of a medieval city the same way again, and trust me, that's exactly the point. So let's leave the heroic ballads and the noble knights by the wayside for a moment, and instead peer into the shadows, where the real stories, the truly terrifying ones, unfolded. But first, find a comfy spot, maybe grab a refreshment, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel to join our growing community of history enthusiasts. Your support really helps us continue uncovering these forgotten facets of the past. Now that you've settled in, let's talk about the silent killer, the invisible enemy that haunted every single inhabitant of every single medieval city: disease. It's not just that people got sick, it's the sheer, relentless, systemic nature of the public health nightmare they faced. Imagine a city without any effective form of sewage system. You don't just have a few overflowing drains, you have human and animal waste accumulating in streets, courtyards, and often within the very homes people lived in. There was no such thing as organized waste disposal in the way we understand it. Refuse, offal, and excrement were simply tossed out into the narrow lanes, left to fester and decompose. Rain would wash some of it away, sometimes, into local water sources, which, ironically, were often the same sources people used for drinking, cooking, and washing. You don't just get a little bit of contamination, you get an entire ecosystem designed for the proliferation of pathogens. The ground was saturated with filth, the air thick with its stench, and the flies, rats, and other vermin, all carriers of disease, thrived in this environment. It was a biological feedback loop of death, endlessly cycling through the population. And what about the impact of the Black Death? That wasn't just an extreme example. It was the catastrophic apotheosis of a system already teetering on the brink. The plague, which wiped out a third to half of Europe's population in short order, found medieval cities to be the perfect incubators and transmission hubs. But it wasn't just the plague. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis, and countless other afflictions were endemic. You couldn't escape them. Every cut could lead to a fatal infection. Every meal could be tainted. Every breath could bring sickness. You're not just dealing with primitive medical knowledge, you're dealing with a complete lack of understanding of germ theory. Physicians, if you could even call them that, often relied on practices like bloodletting or herbal remedies, which, at best, were ineffective and at worst, actively harmful. They had no idea about contagion, no concept of sterile practices. Wounds were often treated with poultices made from whatever was at hand, often exacerbating the infection. Surgeries were brutal, almost always deadly, and performed with unwashed hands and unsterilized instruments. You don't just have a high mortality rate, you have a society where death from illness was an expected, almost daily occurrence, particularly among children. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high, with many failing to reach adulthood. Life expectancy was dramatically lower than today, not because people were inherently weaker, but because their urban environment was a relentless, silent assassin. It's a miracle, really, that anyone survived to old age in such conditions, a testament to sheer biological resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. And yet, no matter how much we dissect these horrors, it's difficult for us, living in an age of sanitation and antibiotics, to fully grasp the sheer, pervasive terror of incurable disease around every corner. You will never look at public health the same way again after contemplating the medieval urban reality. Next, let's talk about a different kind of destructive force, one that you could sometimes see looming on the horizon: fire. Medieval cities were, quite literally, a fire waiting to happen, a vast tinderbox, perpetually on the verge of erupting into catastrophic blazes. And you don't just have a few houses catching fire, you have entire districts, sometimes entire cities, being wiped off the map in a matter of hours or days. The architecture itself was the primary culprit. Imagine structures built almost entirely from wood. Timber frames, often wattle and daub walls, thatch roofs. Even stone buildings often had wooden interiors, wooden roofs, and wooden extensions. You're not just using a little wood, you're building with highly flammable materials as the standard. And what about the close-packed nature of these cities? Streets were narrow, often mere alleys, and buildings leaned into one another, sometimes even extending over the street above. This wasn't by design for efficiency. It was a consequence of limited space within defensive walls and organic, unplanned growth. You don't just have one house burning. The flames leap across the narrow gaps, ignite the eaves of the next, and then the next, creating a cascading inferno. The heat generated by a major urban fire was immense, enough to explode stone, melt metal, and create its own terrifying wind currents, fanning the flames further. And what about the challenges of firefighting? You're not just calling the fire department. There was no such thing. Organized fire brigades were non-existent. When a fire broke out, the response was usually chaotic and improvised. People would form bucket chains from the nearest well or river, a woefully inadequate measure against a raging conflagration. They would also try to pull down adjacent buildings to create a fire break, using hooks and axes, a desperate and often futile effort against a rapidly moving wall of flame. You don't just have primitive methods, you have a completely overwhelmed population. The sound of fire bells or the shouts of "fire" would have struck absolute terror into the hearts of inhabitants, knowing that their entire lives, their homes, and perhaps their very existence could vanish in smoke and ash. Major cities like London, Rouen, and York experienced devastating fires that reshaped their urban landscapes multiple times throughout the Middle Ages, not as rare occurrences, but as periodic, almost inevitable catastrophes. The fear of fire wasn't a distant worry. It was a constant, underlying anxiety for anyone living in these wooden, densely packed environments. You will come to appreciate the modern building codes and fire safety regulations in a profound new way once you visualize the inferno that could consume a medieval city. And what about the perils that weren't as dramatic as plague or fire, but equally insidious, chipping away at safety and well-being every single day? We're talking about infrastructure failures and accidents, the kind of mundane dangers that often get overlooked in the grand narratives of history. You don't just have a few creaky boards, you have a pervasive lack of stable, long-lasting construction combined with minimal maintenance. Imagine walking through a medieval city where buildings, often multiple stories high, were constructed with little understanding of structural engineering, using whatever materials were available, and often without proper foundations. You're not just dealing with natural decay, you're dealing with the stress of centuries, the damp, the vibrations from carts, and the inherent instability of poorly joined timber and stone. It wasn't uncommon for walls to crack, for floors to sag, and for entire sections of buildings to collapse without warning. You don't just have an inconvenient inconvenience, you have a life-threatening incident waiting to happen. And what about bridges? The few bridges that spanned rivers or moats were vital, but often precarious structures, made of wood, subject to rot, erosion, and the force of floods. Their collapse, even a partial one, could lead to numerous drownings and injuries, cutting off vital thoroughfares and causing immense disruption. You're not just falling into a shallow stream, you're potentially falling into a deep, fast-flowing river, weighed down by your medieval attire with little chance of rescue. Beyond collapses, there were the multitude of everyday hazards within homes and workshops. Open fires were the primary source of heating and cooking, but they were also a constant source of danger. Unsafe chimneys, if they even existed, could funnel smoke and soot into living spaces, causing respiratory illnesses. Sparks could fly, igniting nearby thatch or stored materials. You don't just have a minor burn risk, you have a constant threat of conflagration within your own dwelling. And what about industrial accidents? Workshops, particularly those involving metallurgy, tanning, or pottery, were inherently dangerous places. Furnaces, vats of corrosive chemicals, heavy machinery operated by hand, all posed risks of severe burns, maimings, and poisoning. Sanitation was almost non-existent, leading to infections for even minor injuries. And then there was the night. You're not just navigating a dimly lit street, you're traversing absolute darkness. There was no street lighting, save for the occasional lantern carried by a watchman or a wealthy individual. Potholes, open drains, piles of refuse, discarded tools, and uneven cobblestones became invisible traps in the blackness. You don't just stumble, you can fall, break bones, suffer head injuries, and lay helpless until morning, vulnerable to the elements, or worse. These unseen, unsung dangers cumulatively contributed to a pervasive sense of fragility and vulnerability that defined life in medieval urban centers. You will never take a well-lit, smoothly paved street for granted again. Let's shift our focus now from the environmental and structural perils to the immediate, visceral threat of your fellow man: crime, violence, and social disorder. Medieval cities were not paradises of communal harmony. They were often powder kegs of desperation, competition, and outright brutality. And you don't just have petty theft, you have a pervasive atmosphere of insecurity that colored every interaction and every journey, particularly after dusk. The effectiveness of medieval law enforcement, let's be honest, was extremely limited. City watchmen, often untrained and poorly paid, were few in number and often more interested in avoiding trouble than confronting it. Their presence was sporadic and easily circumvented by those intent on mischief or worse. You're not just calling 911, you're often left to your own devices, relying on personal strength, communal reputation, or simply sheer luck. And what about the nature of urban crime? Street crime was rampant. Robbery, assault, and even murder were common occurrences, particularly in the poorly lit alleys and less frequented areas. Wealthy merchants traveling at night were prime targets, but even ordinary citizens were vulnerable. Gangs, often organized around familial ties or district loyalties, operated with a degree of impunity, extorting, stealing, and fighting territorial battles. You don't just encounter individual criminals, you face organized groups who could overwhelm an unsuspecting victim. The lines between what we perceive as criminal activity and legitimate, albeit brutal, forms of dispute resolution were often blurred. Feuds, personal vendettas, and disputes over property or honor could quickly escalate into public brawls and armed confrontations. And yet, this isn't just about individual acts of violence. It's also about broader social disorder. Medieval cities were crucibles of social tension, particularly during times of famine, economic hardship, or political upheaval. Riots were not uncommon, often sparked by food shortages, unfair taxes, or perceived injustices. Guilds, while providing structure, could also become sources of internecine conflict, with rival factions clashing over trade routes, prices, or membership. You don't just see a few isolated incidents. You witness cycles of unrest that could paralyze a city for days or weeks, leading to looting, destruction, and further violence. The lack of a strong, centralized state authority meant that law and order were often fragile, dependent on the charisma or force of personality of local lords or city magistrates, who themselves were often entangled in power struggles. For the average inhabitant, navigating this volatile social landscape required constant vigilance, a strong network of allies, and perhaps a hidden dagger or a stout stick. Medieval urban centers. Let's turn our attention now to an often overlooked aspect of medieval urban life, one that profoundly impacted health and well-being, yet rarely makes it into the popular histories: environmental hazards. Medieval cities, far from being pristine, bucolic havens, were hubs of intense pollution and environmental degradation. You don't just have a bit of smoke in the air, you have a constant assault on your respiratory system and the systematic poisoning of your water supply. Air pollution was a pervasive reality. Think of thousands upon thousands of open hearths for cooking and heating, burning wood and charcoal day and night, producing a constant pall of smoke that hung over the city. Add to that the specific industries that operated within or just outside the city walls. Tanneries, notorious for their use of strong chemicals and putrefying animal hides, released noxious fumes. Blacksmiths, coppersmiths, and other metal workers contributed to the smoky atmosphere. Ceramic kilns, bakeries, and brewers all added their particular effluvia to the already overburdened air. You're not just breathing a little bit of particulate matter, you're breathing air thick with soot, ash, and various toxic fumes, leading to chronic respiratory illnesses, eye irritation, and a general malaise. And what about water contamination? We've already touched upon the lack of sewage systems, but let's elaborate on its profound environmental impact. Rivers and streams flowing through or near cities became open sewers, collecting not just human and animal waste, but also the runoff from industrial processes. Dyers would empty their vats, tanners their chemical solutions, butchers their offal and blood, all directly into the nearest watercourse. You don't just have a slightly dirty river, you have a biological cocktail of disease, making the water completely unsafe for consumption, yet often used as the only accessible source. Wells, too, were often contaminated by seepage from cesspits and overflowing privies, turning vital water sources into conduits for illness. You're not just consuming polluted water, you're consuming a concentrated brew of everything the city considered waste. Beyond direct pollution, there was the broader impact of resource depletion on the immediate surroundings of medieval cities. Cities were gluttonous consumers of resources, particularly wood for fuel, construction, and charcoal production. The demand for timber led to deforestation in the areas surrounding urban centers, stripping forests bare and altering the local ecosystem. You're not just cutting down a few trees, you're creating barren landscapes, increasing soil erosion, and potentially impacting local climate and rainfall patterns. This deforestation also meant that sourcing wood required longer and more arduous journeys, further straining resources and increasing costs. And what about the waste products generated by large urban populations? Beyond human and industrial waste, there were mountains of refuse that often simply piled up, sometimes outside the city gates, sometimes in designated dumps within the city itself. These putrefying heaps attracted vermin, served as breeding grounds for disease, and released more noxious odors into the air. You don't just live in a crowded place. You live in an environment that actively worked against your health and well-being, a testament to the fact that early urban development was a messy, often self-destructive process. You will gain a new appreciation for environmental regulations and waste management systems, realizing the profound impact their absence had on daily life. So, having journeyed into the dark corners of medieval urban reality, what have we truly discovered? It's clear that medieval cities, no matter how vital they were as centers of commerce, culture, and power, were profoundly dangerous places. And you don't just see a few isolated threats. You encounter a relentless, multifaceted assault on human life, health, and peace of mind. We've seen how the silent killer of disease, fueled by a complete lack of sanitation and medical understanding, transformed cities into breeding grounds for epidemics. You will remember the sheer volume of human and animal waste flowing openly in the streets, infecting water, and creating an almost unimaginable environment of filth. We've witnessed the constant, terrifying threat of catastrophic fires, born from the very architecture and density of these urban centers, capable of wiping out entire communities in a fiery maelstrom. You will recall the desperate, often futile attempts to combat blazes that raged unchecked. We've uncovered the less dramatic but equally deadly hazards of infrastructure failures, from collapsing buildings and precarious bridges to the myriad of accidents stemming from open fires, dangerous workshops, and the absolute darkness of medieval nights. You will no longer overlook the subtle yet deadly dangers of everyday structural instability. We've delved into the human element, the ever-present shadow of crime, violence, and social disorder, where ineffective law enforcement left inhabitants vulnerable to robbery, assault, and the capricious whims of powerful factions or desperate individuals. You will appreciate the relative security of modern civil society after considering the prevalence of medieval urban lawlessness. And finally, we've explored the pervasive environmental hazards, the constant air pollution from countless hearths and industries, the poisoning of water sources, and the ecological degradation caused by rampant resource depletion. You will realize that medieval cities were, in many ways, actively unhealthy environments. And yet, no matter how bleak this picture seems, there's another side to this story: the extraordinary resilience of the people who lived in these conditions. Medieval city dwellers not only survived, but often thrived, building communities, establishing trade networks, and creating astonishing works of art and architecture, all while staring down these omnipresent dangers. You don't just find a population struggling, you find one that adapted, innovated within its constraints, and somehow persevered. These continuous struggles, these inherent dangers, were not just hindrances, they were also powerful catalysts. They slowly, painfully led to innovations. The necessity to prevent fires led to some early forms of building regulations. The need to dispose of waste eventually spurred improvements in basic sanitation, albeit centuries later. The desire for safety led to the gradual development of more organized forms of policing and justice. You don't just have a static world of danger. You have a world where the very pressures of survival laid the groundwork for future urban improvements, for the very foundations of the healthier, safer cities we inhabit today. The hidden dangers of medieval cities were not just a footnote in history. They were a fundamental force that shaped lives, compelled innovation, and ultimately paved the way for the urban landscape we now inhabit. You will know that the cost of urban life in the Middle Ages was immeasurable, paid in countless lives. Yet it was a cost that undeniably pushed humanity forward. So, what are your thoughts on this more realistic portrayal of medieval urban life? Does it change your perception of the past? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into the perils fascinating, please hit that like button. Sharing this video with friends who might also be interested in challenging their historical assumptions would be a huge help. And of course, if you want to keep exploring the less told stories of history with us, make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten past. Your engagement truly fuels our work, allowing us to continue uncovering these compelling and often uncomfortable truths. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll see you in the next one. But let's not leave it there, feeling like all we've discussed is a litany of woes and a triumph over adversity. The narrative of medieval urban centers is far richer, more nuanced, and infinitely more complex than just a tale of survival. It's also a story of burgeoning sophistication, of communities coalescing not just around shared fear, but around shared enterprise, shared faith, and shared aspirations. To truly understand these cities, we need to peel back another layer, to look beyond the immediate threats and consider the underlying societal structures and cultural currents that both shaped and were shaped by this urban existence. Consider, for instance, the intricate social tapestry that defined these cities. They were not monolithic entities, far from it. Within their walls, a delicate, often volatile hierarchy existed. At the very top, of course, you had the ecclesiastical authorities, the bishops, abbots, and powerful clergy whose cathedrals and monasteries often formed the literal and spiritual heart of the city. Their power was immense, extending not just to matters of faith, but also to justice, education, and social welfare. They dictated moral codes, controlled vast tracts of land, and often held significant economic sway through their endowments and charitable institutions. Beneath them, but often vying for influence, were the secular lords, the counts, dukes, and knights, who might either rule directly or hold sway through their landed estates surrounding the city. Their presence guaranteed protection, but also imposed taxes and demanded loyalty. The delicate balance of power between these spiritual and temporal lords was a constant source of tension and, at times, open conflict, with the citizenry often caught in the middle. Yet, this very tension could also be a source of nascent urban independence, as citizens learned to play one power against the other to secure charters, rights, and privileges for themselves. Then came the emerging urban elites, the wealthy merchants and master craftsmen. These were the true engines of urban growth. Merchants, with their caravels and trade routes, brought goods, wealth, and new ideas into the city, connecting it to a wider world. They lived in grand houses, often multi-storied and built of stone or more durable materials, a stark contrast to the timber and wattle homes of the less fortunate. They invested in civic projects, founded guilds, and often formed the core of the city's nascent governmental structures, such as city councils or magistracies. Their accumulation of wealth was a visible symbol of urban success, even as it sometimes fueled resentment from those less fortunate. The master craftsmen, too, wielded considerable influence. Organized into powerful guilds, they controlled production, set quality standards, and regulated apprenticeship. These guilds were more than just economic organizations. They were social and political entities as well, providing a safety net for their members, participating in civic rituals, and often influencing urban policy. A master weaver, a master goldsmith, or a master baker was a respected figure, a pillar of his community. His status derived from his skill and his contribution to the city's economy. Below these elites, forming the bulk of the urban population, were the journeymen and apprentices, the skilled workers learning their trade, hoping one day to become masters themselves. Their lives were often arduous, their wages modest, but they held the promise of upward mobility, a distinguishing feature of urban life compared to the more rigid caste systems of the rural aristocracy. Then came the vast number of unskilled laborers, the porters, water carriers, street sweepers, and casual workers, whose lives were a precarious daily struggle, often dependent on the whims of the market and the mercy of employers. They lived in the most cramped and unsanitary conditions, bore the brunt of disease and famine, and paradoxically formed the essential backbone of the city's physical functioning. And let us not forget the marginalized groups, the beggars, the street children, the prostitutes, the lepers, the Jewish communities in some cities, and other outcasts. Their presence, often concentrated in specific quarters or at the periphery of urban society, highlighted both the social stratification and the limited, yet sometimes existing, forms of charity and social control. The church, through its monasteries and hospices, did provide some relief, but the sheer scale of poverty and human suffering often overwhelmed these efforts. This incredibly diverse population, with its divergent interests and hierarchical relationships, was bound together by a complex web of customs, laws, and shared experiences. Marketplaces were not just centers of commerce, they were social hubs where news was exchanged, rumors spread, and public pronouncements made. Churches were central to life, not just for worship, but for social gatherings, public announcements, and as places of refuge. These shared spaces and shared rituals helped forge a sense of urban identity, often distinct from the rural populations surrounding the city. This collective identity could be fierce, manifesting in civic pride, defense of urban liberties, and even violent uprisings against external lords or internal oppressors. The growth of such complex social structures within the confines of a medieval city was, frankly, astonishing. It represented a slow but steady evolution away from purely feudal bonds and towards a more commercially driven, organized, and self-governing form of community. The very act of living in close proximity, of relying on one another for goods, services, and defense, fostered a unique urban mentality, one that valued collective action, communal welfare, and the protection of urban privileges. But this sense of community didn't emerge without friction. Disputes were constant. Guilds feuded over jurisdiction or economic advantage. Merchants competed fiercely. The powerful sought to consolidate their influence, while the less powerful struggled for a voice. Crime, as we previously discussed, was a constant concern, disrupting the fragile social order. Maintaining civic peace was a perpetual challenge, requiring a combination of formal laws, informal social pressure, and, when necessary, the brute force of a city watch or a lord's men-at-arms. Consider the role of the city council, a nascent form of local government that gradually asserted itself in many urban centers. Guildmasters were responsible for everything from establishing market regulations and overseeing sanitation, or the lack thereof, to defending the city walls and negotiating with external powers. Their existence marked a significant step towards self-governance and represented the growing power of the urban bourgeoisie. They collected taxes, maintained infrastructure, however rudimentary, and dispensed justice, often under the watchful eye of a feudal lord or bishop, but increasingly with an independent mandate. This evolving urban governance was often codified in a city charter, a legal document granted by a king, a lord, or an ecclesiastical authority, which laid out the rights, privileges, and responsibilities of the townsfolk. These charters were fiercely guarded and were often the result of prolonged negotiations, financial payments, or even armed struggle. They granted cities the right to hold markets, collect tolls, establish their own courts, and sometimes even raise their own militias. The possession of a charter was a badge of urban independence, a fundamental component of its identity, and a testament to the collective will of its citizens to carve out a distinct existence within the broader feudal landscape. The very streets these people walked were not just conduits for movement, they were stages for social interaction, public spectacle, and expressions of power. Processions, religious, civic, or celebratory, wound their way through the city, reinforcing hierarchies and communal bonds. Public punishments, often brutal and theatrical, served as stark reminders of the consequences of transgressing societal norms. Feast days and festivals brought the community together in shared celebrations, temporarily dissolving some of the rigid social distinctions. The sounds of the city, the clang of the blacksmith, the cries of street hawkers, the pealing of church bells, the cacophony of the marketplace, were the constant soundtrack to this vibrant, often chaotic urban life. And let's not overlook the intellectual and artistic contributions fostered by these cities. They became centers of learning, housing cathedral schools and later universities, which attracted scholars and students from across Europe. The pursuit of knowledge, while often theological in nature, also encompassed law, medicine, and philosophy, laying the groundwork for future intellectual awakenings. The burgeoning merchant class, with its newfound wealth, became patrons of the arts, commissioning elaborate guild halls, beautiful stained glass windows for churches, and illuminated manuscripts. Skilled artisans produced exquisite goods, from intricate jewelry to finely woven textiles, shaping the material culture of the age. The concentration of wealth, talent, and patronage within urban centers made them crucibles of creativity, places where new ideas could germinate and artistic expression could flourish. The very architecture of the medieval city, beyond its defensive walls, told a story. The towering cathedral, dominating the skyline, proclaimed the city's spiritual devotion and the power of the church. The imposing guild halls, often adorned with elaborate carvings and symbols of their trades, spoke of mercantile wealth, corporate identity, and civic pride. The bustling market square, often overlooked by the town hall, was the beating heart of commerce. Even the narrower, winding streets, leading to forgotten corners and hidden courtyards, hinted at a complex, organic growth, a city built layer upon layer over centuries. This architectural landscape was not just functional, it was symbolic, a physical manifestation of the city's values, its struggles, and its aspirations. So, when we consider the dangers of medieval urban life, we are not just talking about physical threats or sanitary woes. We are talking about the immense pressure under which these complex societies forged their identities, developed their institutions, and innovated their pathways to progress. The very act of surviving and thriving in such perilous environments demanded an extraordinary degree of resilience, organization, and adaptive capacity from its inhabitants. The challenges were not just external, they were internal. How to govern a diverse population, how to manage limited resources, how to maintain social cohesion in the face of inequality and conflict. The development of civic institutions, the slow maturation of urban law, the emergence of a distinctive urban culture. These were all responses to the inherent difficulties of congregating large numbers of people in a confined space during an era of limited technology and pervasive threats. The medieval city was a grand experiment in human collective living, often messy, frequently inefficient, sometimes brutal, yet undeniably dynamic and ultimately transformative. It reshaped society, creating new classes, new forms of wealth, and new political structures. It fostered intellectual and artistic movements that reverberated across continents. It connected distant lands through intricate trade networks, and it provided a space, however perilous, where individuals could escape the rigid strictures of feudal agriculture and pursue new opportunities, hone new skills, and perhaps even find a measure of autonomy. To view these cities solely through the lens of their dangers is to miss the extraordinary ingenuity and perseverance that allowed them not just to endure, but to flourish, to become vibrant centers of not just commerce, but also culture, thought, and self-governance. The cost, as we said, was immense, but the eventual dividends, in terms of human progress, societal organization, and the very foundations of modern urban life, were incalculable. The precarious existence forged a robust spirit, and the crucible of urban adversity refined the human capacity for innovation and cooperation in ways that continued to shape the world for centuries to come. Indeed, the legacy of medieval cities is not merely architectural ruins or cryptic legal texts. It's etched into the very fabric of our modern urban centers. The concepts of self-governance, market regulations, public services, and even the architectural typology of a city center with its public squares and prominent civic buildings can all trace aspects of their genesis back to the medieval urban experience. The struggle for clean water, the battle against disease, the necessity of ordered markets, these are not just historical footnotes. They are continuous threads connecting us to our medieval predecessors. They struggled with these problems in an embryonic form, often without the scientific understanding or technological tools we possess today. Yet their efforts laid the initial groundwork. Take legal systems, for example. The rudimentary urban courts that evolved in medieval cities, often separate from the lord's manorial court, represented a significant step towards a more specialized and accessible form of justice for town dwellers. These courts dealt with disputes between merchants, settled property claims, and addressed local crimes. While far from perfect, they were the ancestors of modern municipal courts, demonstrating an early recognition that urban life, with its unique complexities, required its own distinct legal framework. The concept of urban law, developed through charters and gradually refined by custom and precedent, provided a degree of predictability and order essential for commerce and social stability. And what about property rights? In an agrarian society, land ownership was paramount and often tied to feudal obligations. In a city, while land was still important, the ownership of buildings, access to market stalls, and rights to conduct trade became equally vital. The establishment of secure property rights and the means to transfer them were crucial for economic growth. Medieval cities saw the development of systems for recording land transactions, for establishing inheritance laws within an urban context, and for adjudicating disputes over property, essential components of any functioning urban economy. The concept of citizenship itself, distinct from being a mere subject of a lord or king, began to take on a new meaning within city walls. To be a burger or Bürger, from the German Burg, meaning fortress or walled town, carried specific rights and responsibilities. It implied a degree of participation in urban governance, even if limited to the wealthy, and a collective responsibility for the city's welfare and defense. This was a profound shift from purely feudal allegiances. Loyalty shifted from an individual lord to a collective entity, the city itself. This embryonic form of civic identity would gradually evolve into the modern notion of citizenship. Moreover, the sheer volume of goods moving through medieval cities fostered the development of sophisticated financial instruments. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, and early forms of banking, often facilitated by Italian merchants and Jewish financiers, emerged to navigate the complexities and dangers of long-distance trade. These innovations reduced the need to transport large quantities of coinage, mitigating risks of theft and making intercity commerce more efficient. Without these foundational financial infrastructures, the extensive trade networks that characterized the later Middle Ages simply wouldn't have been possible. And communication. The urban environment necessitated and facilitated better communication. Couriers rode between cities, carrying news and commercial intelligence. The public crier announced decrees and market prices. News and information, however informal, flowed more readily in a city than in a dispersed rural setting. This increased flow of information, though not always accurate, was vital for economic activity and for maintaining a sense of shared community. Education, too, found a more fertile ground in urban settings. While monasteries had long been centers of learning, the rise of cathedral schools, and later universities, predominantly located in cities, marked a shift. These institutions, often struggling for autonomy from both church and state, became vibrant centers of intellectual discourse. They trained lawyers, doctors, theologians, and administrators, providing the intellectual infrastructure for both urban governance and the broader society. The very presence of a university or a prominent cathedral school acted as a magnet, attracting scholars and students and diversifying the urban population with intellectually curious individuals. The constant push and pull of different interest groups within the city, the guilds, the merchants, the church, the nobility, led to the development of early techniques of political negotiation and compromise. These were not always peaceful, often involving strikes, riots, or even armed conflicts, but they were part of a learning process in how to manage diverse interests within a complex political entity. The city became a microcosm for managing societal forces through mechanisms other than pure feudal decree. Think also about the concept of public works. While medieval sanitation was notoriously poor, some early efforts illustrate a nascent understanding of collective needs. Aqueducts were occasionally repaired or built, though not on the scale of Rome. City gates and walls were maintained. Bridges were constructed. Marketplaces were paved. Public wells dug. These were tangible expressions of civic investment, driven by the collective needs of the urban population and funded by urban taxes or philanthropic contributions. They represent the glimmerings of a public sphere where communal resources were pooled for communal benefits. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies is the spirit of innovation itself. Confronted by persistent problems, fire, disease, waste, defense, city dwellers were compelled to find solutions. This continuous problem solving, often through trial and error, laid the foundations for scientific inquiry and technological advancement. Better building materials, improved water systems, rudimentary public health measures, and advances in military engineering were all spurred by the demands of urban living. The very density of population, while creating challenges, also fostered an environment where ideas could be exchanged and refined more rapidly than in isolated rural communities. It's tempting to look at the medieval city and see only squalor and danger. That's a part of the truth, an undeniable part, But to stop there is to miss the deeper, more profound narrative, that these spaces, despite their immense drawbacks, were also laboratories of human ingenuity and resilience. They were the melting pots where the old feudal order began to break down, where new economic systems took root, where civic identity slowly displaced purely personal allegiance, and where the seeds of modern governance, law, and even science were planted. The inhabitants of medieval cities were not simply victims of their circumstances. They were active agents in shaping their world. They fought for their freedoms, built their institutions, traded their goods, and worshipped their god, all while navigating a daily existence fraught with peril. Their struggles were real, their losses immense, but their achievements were equally profound. They created enduring structures, both physical and conceptual, that propelled humanity out of the Dark Ages and laid crucial groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern era. So, the next time you walk through a historic city center, or even consider the complex functioning of your own urban environment, take a moment to reflect on its medieval roots. Beneath the modern facade, beneath the paved roads and the gleaming skyscrapers, lie layers of history, of human struggle and triumph, directly traceable to those early urban pioneers. The cost of urban life in the Middle Ages was indeed high, but the historical dividends, the shaping of our societies, our economies, and even our very understanding of community were immeasurable. This deep dive into the hidden dangers and then the profound impacts of medieval urban life should leave us with a sense of awe, not just for the challenges overcome, but for the inherent capacity of humanity to adapt, organize, and build, even in the harshest of conditions. It challenges the romanticized notions of a simpler, idyllic past, and replaces them with a gritty, complex, and ultimately far more fascinating reality. It's a reminder that progress is rarely linear and often emerges from the most intense pressures and the most arduous struggles. The medieval city, in its dangerous and dynamic existence, is a testament to this enduring truth. Urban ecosystems. Beyond the overarching dangers and the grand societal structures, what was it really like to live there, day in and day out, for the ordinary person? We've touched upon the major threats, but let's try to paint a more vivid picture of the micro-experiences that defined these lives. Imagine waking up in a cramped, often shared bed in a multi-story building. The sounds of the city would immediately seep into your sleep. The distant braying of donkeys or horses, the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer already at work, the rustle of straw as a neighbor stirred, the faint smell of wood smoke mingled with something less pleasant from the street below. Depending on your status, your room might be dark and windowless, or perhaps have a small, glassless, shuttered opening onto the street, allowing in light but little protection from noise or elements. Your first task might be to fetch water. The trip to the communal well or a public fountain was a social occasion, a chance to exchange gossip and news. It was a laborious task, carrying heavy buckets back to your dwelling, where the water would be used for cooking, limited washing, and drinking. The quality of this water was a constant gamble, a daily lottery with your health. Many people, particularly the poorer classes, might rely on ale or weak beer as their primary beverage, as it was safer than untreated water, and fermentation killed many pathogens. Breakfast would be simple, perhaps a piece of bread, maybe some cheese if you were lucky, or a bowl of pottage, a thick, often bland vegetable and grain stew that formed the staple of most diets. Meat was a luxury, rarely eaten by the poor, and reserved for feast days or for the tables of the wealthy. The meal would be eaten quickly, often standing, as the demands of the day beckoned. If you were a craftsman, your workshop would likely be on the ground floor of your home, or perhaps a separate room in a guild hall. The street would be your shop window. Your day would be filled with repetitive, skilled labor, often beginning at dawn and ending at dusk, dictated by the available light and the demands of customers. Apprentices and journeymen would work alongside you, learning the trade, subject to your direct supervision and often your temper. The pride in one's craft was immense, as was the pressure to produce quality goods that would ensure your reputation and livelihood. If you were a merchant, your day might involve haggling in the marketplace, arranging shipments, or poring over ledgers, if you were literate, in your counting house. Trade was a risky business, vulnerable to piracy, bad weather, political unrest, and fluctuating prices. Diplomacy, calculation, and a keen eye for opportunity were essential. Your reputation for honesty and reliability was your most valuable asset, ensuring future transactions and credit. For the vast majority of unskilled laborers, the day was a frantic search for casual work. This might involve loading and unloading goods at the city gates or docks, sweeping streets, digging ditches, carrying messages, or performing any number of menial tasks for a meager daily wage. The threat of unemployment was omnipresent, and a single illness or injury could plunge a family into destitution. These workers often lived hand to mouth, their survival a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness. Children in medieval cities had a childhood remarkably different from our own. Many would begin contributing to the household economy from a very young age, often as young as 5 or 6. If they were lucky enough to be apprenticed, their youth would be spent in diligent labor and strict tutelage, their path mapped out for them. Play, while not entirely absent, was often secondary to work. Education, beyond basic religious instruction, was a privilege reserved for the wealthy or for those destined for the clergy. Women's roles were incredibly diverse. While domestic work was universally expected, many women also played vital roles in the urban economy. They ran small businesses, brewed ale, baked bread, spun yarn, wove cloth, or assisted their husbands in their trades. Widows often inherited their husbands' businesses and managed them independently, demonstrating a degree of economic autonomy not always afforded to women in other contexts. Childbirth, however, was a constant danger for women in their fertile years, contributing significantly to high mortality rates. Lunch and dinner would again revolve around bread and pottage, supplemented by seasonal vegetables like cabbage, leeks, or beans. Fruit was available in season, but often less common for the poor. The communal hearth, or oven, if you had access to one, was a focal point for cooking. Spices, once a luxury, were becoming more accessible, but still out of reach for the average citizen. The diet, while often monotonous, was generally nutritious, though vulnerable to famine during crop failures. Throughout the day, the scent of the city permeated everything. The omnipresent smell of human and animal waste, rotting garbage, stale food, and unwashed bodies would cling to the air, often masked by burning wood, incense from churches, and the aromas of baking bread or cooking food. These smells were an intrinsic part of the urban experience, a constant reminder of the city's vitality and its inherent insanitation. Noise was another defining feature. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the rumble of cartwheels, the shouts of vendors, the calls of beggars, the ringing of church bells marking the hours, the incessant chatter of crowds, the squawking of chickens and geese, the barking of dogs. The medieval city was an assault on the senses, a symphony of human and animal activity that rarely quieted down, even at night. As dusk fell, street lighting was virtually non-existent outside of wealthy districts or near important public buildings protected by a watchman. The city plunged into a deep, oppressive darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a torch or a lantern carried by a passing soul. This darkness amplified the sense of danger, making travel treacherous and fostering an atmosphere where crime was more easily committed. People would stay indoors, huddling by the fire, telling stories, or engaging in simple domestic tasks. Evenings were often spent within your immediate neighborhood, as venturing far from your home was risky. Taverns and alehouses were popular gathering places, offering warmth, drink, and companionship. They were also hotbeds of gossip, rumor, and potential trouble. For the pious, evening prayers, or vespers, at the nearest church would be a common activity. Sleep, when it came, might be interrupted by the sounds of rats scurrying, mice gnawing, or the distant cry of a night watchman. The fear of fire was a constant companion, especially in the densely packed, timber-framed buildings. A single spark could engulf an entire street, turning a peaceful night into a terrifying struggle for survival. Public holidays and feast days broke the monotony of daily life. These were occasions for celebration, for communal eating and drinking, for religious processions, music, and sometimes boisterous entertainment. They provided a vital outlet for urban communities, reinforcing social bonds and offering a temporary respite from the hardships of daily existence. Churches would be adorned, markets bustling with special goods, and the general mood would lighten, if only for a day or two. Disease remained an ever-present threat. The poor diet, lack of hygiene, and prevalence of vermin made people exceptionally vulnerable. A fever, a cough, a festering wound, any of these could quickly escalate into a life-threatening condition, particularly for the young and the old. The sheer number of deaths, especially during outbreaks of plague or widespread epidemics, meant that loss and grief were common experiences. Life expectancy was considerably lower than today, and the constant awareness of mortality shaped religious beliefs and attitudes towards life itself. Despite all these challenges, life in the medieval city was also characterized by a remarkable degree of human connection. The necessity of mutual aid, the tight-knit nature of guilds and neighborhoods, the shared experiences of hardship and celebration fostered strong communal bonds. People knew their neighbors, relied on them in times of trouble, and often found solace and support within their immediate community. The constant threat of danger might have pushed people apart, but it more often forced them together, creating a resilient social fabric. The beauty of the medieval city, often overlooked amidst the squalor, lay in its intricate details. The craftsmanship of a carpenter, the delicate illumination of a manuscript produced in a city scriptorium, the vibrant colors of a street fresco, the haunting melodies of a troubadour's song echoing through narrow lanes. It was a beauty born of human endeavor, artistry, and faith, often juxtaposed against a harsh reality. Ultimately, to inhabit a medieval city was to live a life saturated with sensory experiences, the smells, the sounds, the sights, the constant physical demands, and fraught with both tangible and intangible dangers. Yet, it was also a life imbued with purpose, with community, with the rhythms of work and worship, and with the enduring human capacity to create, connect, and persevere against overwhelming odds. It was a demanding existence, but one that undeniably shaped the trajectory of human civilization, laying the grimy, glorious foundations for the complex urban world we know today. We've covered the hidden and not so hidden dangers of medieval urban life, how humans adapted, innovated, and persevered, and what daily life would have entailed on a more intimate level. But let's take a final leap and consider how these cities, their challenges, and their solutions laid the intellectual groundwork for later periods like the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment, ultimately influencing the modern world in subtle yet profound ways. It's not just about physical infrastructure or nascent legal systems. It's also about a shift in mindset. The very agglomeration of people in cities with their diverse backgrounds and often conflicting interests, fostered a new kind of social dynamism. In the rural feudal system, roles were largely predetermined, and social mobility was minimal. In a city, while hierarchy was still present, raw talent, entrepreneurial spirit, and luck offered avenues for advancement that simply didn't exist elsewhere. This created an environment where innovation was incentivized, not just for survival, but for profit and prestige. This burgeoning economic activity and the wealth it generated also fueled a gradual demand for more accurate measurements, better record-keeping, and more sophisticated intellectual tools. Merchants needed reliable ways to weigh goods, calculate profits, and track debts. Artisans required precise methods for their crafts. This practical necessity often nudged intellectual exploration, leading to improvements in mathematics, accounting, and even early forms of engineering. The practical challenges of building multi-story structures in congested areas, for example, pushed the boundaries of architectural and structural knowledge. The establishment of universities within cities was a pivotal development. These institutions, often founded under the patronage of monarchs or the church, became magnets for scholars.